Somewhere in a kitchen drawer or a bathroom cabinet right now, there is a small orange bottle holding pills so light you could balance 10 of them on a fingertip. Most of the people who take one every single morning have no real idea what they are actually swallowing or where it came from. 85 years ago, a nearly identical pill was pressed into the hand of a 19-year-old soldier marching through a forest in Belgium. He was told to keep walking, keep fighting, do not stop, not for 10 days straight. Same molecule, almost the exact same 3 milligram dose, two completely different wars. This is the story of how one forgotten laboratory experiment ended up shaping the outcome of the fall of France, got handed out to American housewives as a diet pill, and is right now missing from pharmacy shelves across an entire country. Almost nobody realizes these are all the same story. Long before any of that, there was a plant. A leafless, jointed, almost scrubby little shrub called ephedra, growing wild across the dry hills of northern China and Mongolia. Traditional healers there had been drying it and brewing it into a bitter, grassy tea for thousands of years. They used it to open tight lungs, clear congestion, and treat asthma attacks that would otherwise leave a person gasping through the night. They called it Ma Huang. Nobody writing those medical texts had any concept of chemistry the way we would understand it today. They simply knew the tea worked. A patient who drank it could often breathe freely again within minutes, and their heart would race a little as it happened, though nobody yet understood why that was. For roughly 5,000 years, Ma Huang stayed almost exactly where it started, a regional remedy passed down through generation after generation of Chinese medicine, largely unknown outside of Asia. Then, in the 19th century, Western chemists finally got curious enough to ask what was actually sitting inside that ancient tea. In 1887, in a laboratory at the University of Berlin, a young Romanian chemist named Lazar Edeleanu managed to isolate the active compound behind that Chinese remedy, and then, almost as an afterthought, synthesized something slightly different. A cousin molecule. He called it phenylisopropylamine. Today, almost everyone just calls it amphetamine, a shortened version of its full chemical name, alpha-methyl-phenethylamine. Edeleanu wrote his findings down, published them in the appropriate journal, and moved on to other work. He had no idea what he was holding. Nobody did. There was no obvious use for it. No disease it was known to treat. No market waiting for it. So it sat there, buried in chemistry literature, cited by almost nobody, for the next 40 years. Meanwhile, the plant it descended from kept working exactly as it always had. By the early 1900s, Western doctors had identified ephedrine, the compound from Ma Huang, as a genuinely effective asthma treatment, and demand for it exploded across Europe and the United States. There was just one problem. Almost the entire global supply of raw ephedra came from China, shipped by the ton across an ocean, subject to every disruption that distance, war, and unstable trade routes could throw at it. By the 1920s, doctors and pharmaceutical chemists in America were staring down a real shortage. Patients needed the drug. The supply chain simply could not reliably deliver it, year after year. Somebody was going to have to build a synthetic replacement. And in a laboratory in Los Angeles, somebody already had, 40 years earlier, without realizing what he had made. In 1927, a chemist named Gordon Alice set out to solve that ephedrine shortage. He was not trying to build a stimulant. He was trying to build a substitute asthma drug, nothing more ambitious than that. He dug up Edeleanu's forgotten compound, synthesized a version of it himself, and, in the tradition of a lot of early 20th century chemistry, tested it on the only subject he had immediate and convenient access to: himself. Alice later described what happened as a rush of alertness, confidence, and a kind of buoyant, wide-awake euphoria that had absolutely nothing to do with clearing his sinuses. His congestion did clear, sure, but that was not the part he could not stop thinking about afterward. By 1932, the pharmaceutical company Smith, Kline and French had turned that same compound into a product called the Benzedrine inhaler, sold over the counter, no prescription required, marketed simply as a nasal decongestant for the common cold. It looked completely harmless. A small tube you cracked open in your hand and breathed in whenever you had a stuffy nose. Almost nobody buying it at the corner drugstore understood that they were holding the first mass-market amphetamine product in human history. But there was a problem. Nobody outside a small circle of chemists and curious college students had really grasped what this compound could do to the human mind under real sustained pressure. It was being sold as a cold remedy. Word had already started spreading that people were cracking the inhalers open just to chew on the drug-soaked paper strip inside, purely for the lift it gave them. The stimulant effect was sitting there, essentially unexploited at any serious scale. That was about to change, 8 time zones away, inside a German pharmaceutical laboratory with a very different idea about what an endlessly energetic, sleep-resistant population might be useful for. In 1938, the Berlin-based Temmler Pharmaceutical Company took a close chemical relative of Alice's discovery, methamphetamine, and packaged it into a small white tablet they called Pervitin. A German military doctor named Otto Ranke got hold of it and ran an experiment on 90 college students, timing exactly how long they could stay awake, alert, and functional. The results convinced him he had found something the German army genuinely needed. Ranke wrote in his own notes that with Pervitin, a person could keep working for 36 to 50 hours, without any noticeable fatigue. He was not just studying the drug from a distance either. He used it on himself constantly to manage his own punishing schedule. By April of 1940, that laboratory finding had become official military policy. A so-called stimulant decree ordered the tablets shipped to the front lines of the German Army and Air Force, timed directly ahead of the coming invasion of France. What had started as a college experiment about staying awake for an exam had become, in barely 2 years, a wartime supply order signed at the highest levels. Between April and July of 1940 alone, more than 35 million tablets of Pervitin and a nearly identical compound called Isofan were shipped out to roughly 3 million German soldiers, sailors, and pilots. At the Temmler Werk factory back in Berlin, production ramped up to as many as 833,000 tablets pressed in a single day, running around the clock to keep pace with military demand. Soldiers in the ranks gave the pills their own nicknames, the way soldiers always do: Stuka tablets, after the dive bombers screaming overhead; Hermann Göring pills, after the head of the German Air Force; tank chocolate, because the little boxes almost looked like ordinary candy; pilot's chocolate, for the flight crews who took them before missions. The instructions printed on the packaging recommended 1 or 2 tablets only as needed, strictly to maintain sleeplessness. Soldiers under real combat stress ignored that guidance constantly, taking 3, 4, sometimes more, whenever the exhaustion started to catch up with them. This is the part most people never learn about the invasion of France. It was not just tank tactics and air superiority that let German forces move faster than anyone thought possible through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. It was a population of soldiers who had been chemically stripped of their basic need to sleep. Picture one of those soldiers on the 9th day of marching. His eyes are hollow, ringed dark from days without any real rest. His hands shake slightly as he dry swallows another tablet. No water available. His heart pounds harder than it should for a man simply walking, boots dragging through mud and broken branches. He has not eaten a proper meal in almost 2 days because the drug kills his appetite right alongside his exhaustion. Some men in his position began hallucinating faint shapes at the edge of the tree line as the sleep deprivation deepened. Some turned suddenly and viciously aggressive toward their own commanding officers. A problem serious enough that military leadership began to worry it threatened basic discipline across entire units. He keeps marching anyway. That is exactly what the tablet in his pocket was designed to make him do. The British War Office later tried to make sense of exactly what they were up against, And their own wartime estimate lines up with the German records almost precisely. Roughly 35 million tablets, delivered to about 3 million men in the space of just 3 months. Historian Norman Ohler, who spent years digging through German military archives researching the subject, credits this chemical push directly with making the supposedly impossible happen. A 10-day forced march and offensive through terrain, the Allied commanders had judged too difficult to cross with any real speed. That offensive is the one that trapped the British Army against the coast at Dunkirk, forcing one of the most desperate evacuations in modern military history. Not manpower alone, not tanks alone. A pharmaceutical decision made inside a Berlin boardroom changed the physical limits of what an entire army could accomplish in a single week. The cost of that decision showed up almost immediately, and it did not stay contained to the battlefield. Wehrmacht medical records and soldiers' own wartime letters describe heart failures, sudden psychotic breaks, and men who simply collapsed once the chemical finally released its grip on their bodies. The exact death toll tied directly to Pervitin use is still debated among historians, since so much of the underlying military documentation was incomplete, lost, or deliberately destroyed by the end of the war. But the pattern that does survive in the records is consistent, and it is disturbing. And that was only the beginning of the story, not the end of it. By 1962, the United States Food and Drug Administration estimated that 8 billion amphetamine pills were being manufactured every single year, in America alone. By 1970, roughly 9.7 million Americans, about 5% of the entire population, were using some form of prescription amphetamine. Life magazine reported that 2 billion diet pill tablets were being prescribed annually through the 1960s for weight loss purposes alone. A wartime weapon had become a national habit, sitting quietly in millions of medicine cabinets. Amphetamine did not just help win a battle and then quietly disappear back into a laboratory drawer somewhere. It taught 2 governments, and eventually an entire pharmaceutical industry, a lesson that nobody involved ever fully unlearned. That you could chemically engineer a population's stamina, its mood, even its appetite, and that people would not just tolerate that, they would actively ask for more of it. This is the part of the story that keeps quietly repeating for the next 80 years in one form or another. Not everyone inside Germany was comfortable with what was happening, even at the height of it. Late in 1939 and into 1940, a Reich health official named Leo Conti raised alarms about Pervitin's addictive potential and pushed for it to be formally restricted before things got worse. On July 1st, 1941, the drug was officially placed under Germany's opium law, technically requiring a prescription from that point forward. It barely mattered in practice. The army had already grown structurally dependent on it. 10 million more tablets shipped to German troops that same year, regulation on paper or not. If you are finding this video interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. Here is the full chain, laid out domino by domino, because once you see it laid out like this, you cannot unsee it. A shortage of a Chinese asthma plant forces American chemists to go looking for a synthetic replacement. That search leads a chemist named Gordon Alice back to a compound first synthesized in 1887 and then forgotten for 40 years. He tests it on himself, and Smith, Klein, and French turns it into an over-the-counter cold remedy called Benzedrine. A German pharmaceutical company adapts a close chemical cousin of that same compound into a military stimulant. A German military doctor tests it on a group of 90 college students and convinces his superiors it belongs on the battlefield. In April of 1940, that conviction becomes an official military order, and 35 million tablets flood the front lines. Soldiers who could not possibly stay awake for a 10-day offensive suddenly can. The offensive succeeds at a speed nobody on the Allied side had planned or prepared for. The British Army gets trapped at Dunkirk, and the fall of France follows soon after. Word of the German super soldier pill reaches Allied high command. Rather than reject the tool because of who invented it, they adopt the exact same approach for their own troops. American General Dwight Eisenhower personally orders 500,000 Benzedrine tablets for his own forces. An entire generation of soldiers on both sides of the war comes home already personally familiar with what amphetamine feels like, and already comfortable asking a doctor for it. The same pharmaceutical companies that had been supplying the war effort now have a massive peacetime market sitting right in front of them. Those veterans, and just as importantly, their wives. 85 years later, that identical molecule, repackaged and rebranded for attention deficit disorder, is the exact medication a parent cannot find on pharmacy shelves this week. One supply shortage, back in the 1920s, built this entire chain from nothing. Another supply shortage, a century later, is where the story currently sits, still unresolved. Germany was not the only country running this exact experiment during the war. Japan's military had also been distributing methamphetamine under the brand name Philipon to factory workers pushing through brutal wartime production quotas and to pilots flying suicide missions late in the conflict. When the war finally ended, Japan found itself sitting on enormous stockpiles of military-grade methamphetamine, with no war left to fight and no obvious use for what remained. Rather than destroy the surplus, manufacturers simply dumped it onto the open civilian market. The result was staggering. By 1954, at the height of what became known as Japan's first methamphetamine epidemic, researchers estimated there were over 2 million users in a population of only 88.5 million people. 2 countries, 2 militaries, the exact same chemical family, producing 2 separate epidemics almost simultaneously an ocean apart. And at the time, almost nobody was connecting the 2 stories. America's own military never fully let go of the drug either. The same stimulant Eisenhower had ordered by the hundreds of thousands of tablets for the fight against Germany followed American troops straight into Korea and then into Vietnam a generation later, issued to soldiers to manage long patrols, night watches, and the kind of exhaustion combat produces no matter which decade it happens in. So, while housewives back home were being sold the same chemical as a way to get through laundry and grocery shopping, their sons overseas were being issued it as standard equipment. The wartime logic from 1940 had never actually gone away. It had simply become routine. Back in America, the post-war pivot happened fast, and it was deliberate. Smith, Klein, and French, along with rival companies, began marketing amphetamine and a combined amphetamine and sedative pill called Dexamyl, directly at a very specific audience: women. Full-page advertisements ran in magazines like Cosmopolitan and Ladies' Home Journal, offering a pill for what the copy quietly implied was simply the exhausting condition of being a housewife. Tired, irritable, struggling to keep up with an impossibly demanding daily schedule of cooking, cleaning, and raising children. The pill promised energy, a lighter mood, and just as important to the marketing, appetite suppression, and steady weight loss. It did not stop with housewives either. Long-haul truckers took it to push through overnight drives on empty highways. College students took so-called pep pills to cram through exam week. Beat Generation writers, Jack Kerouac reportedly among them, used it to fuel marathon, sleepless writing sessions. Professional athletes quietly used it as a competitive edge, decades before modern doping regulations existed to catch them. By the 1950s and 60s, amphetamine had stopped being a wartime secret and become something almost ordinary. A pill sitting in the medicine cabinet of an enormous share of American households, taken for granted the way people take aspirin for granted today. The production numbers back up just how ordinary it had truly become. That 1962 FDA estimate of 8 billion pills a year works out to dozens of individual doses for every single adult in the country, though usage was of course concentrated far more heavily among certain groups than others. So-called rainbow diet pills, color-coded combinations of amphetamine and other compounds, were dispensed by weight loss clinics that sprang up across the country with almost no meaningful oversight from federal regulators watching how they operated. Here is how the exact same drug is controlled today and it explains a lot about the crisis still playing out in pharmacies right now. Every single year, the Drug Enforcement Administration sets what is called an aggregate production quota, a hard legal ceiling, measured out in grams on exactly how much amphetamine every pharmaceutical manufacturer in the entire country is legally permitted to produce. Go even a single gram over that federally set number, and a company is breaking the law. That quota system did not appear out of nowhere. It is a direct descendant of the crackdown that was already coming. This is the part that follows a very familiar playbook. For roughly 3 decades, pharmaceutical companies and a loosely regulated network of so-called diet doctors kept prescribing amphetamines through magazine advertisements, weight loss clinics, and ordinary family physicians, even as medical literature increasingly documented dependence, elevated blood pressure, and outright stimulant-induced psychosis among long-term users. It is essentially the same basic pattern the tobacco industry ran with cigarettes. Keep selling a known, profitable product on reassurance and convenience for as long as humanly possible, while the internal and academic understanding of its real risk quietly keeps piling up in the background, unaddressed. The difference here is that amphetamine's version of that playbook was not hidden away in some corporate vault, waiting decades to surface in a lawsuit. It was happening in plain sight, in ordinary doctors' offices, all across the country, in full public view. The story that finally cracked it wide open belongs to a journalist named Susanna McBee. In 1969, she went undercover, walking into one unfamiliar doctor's office after another across the country. Each visit followed almost the same script: a rushed, roughly 3-minute physical exam. And then she walked back out the door holding hundreds of colorful amphetamine pills, sometimes handed over before she had even finished describing a symptom to the doctor. Her reporting helped expose just how far the entire prescribing culture had drifted from anything resembling real medical oversight, and it landed at exactly the right moment to catch public attention. Public pressure built quickly after that. The federal government responded with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, and by 1971, amphetamine had been formally placed in Schedule II, the tightest legal category still available for a drug that is officially considered to have a recognized medical use. The crackdown did not make the underlying compound disappear. It just sent the pharmaceutical industry looking for a way back in through the front door, this time wearing a white coat instead of a diet clinic sign. A related stimulant, methylphenidate, had actually been synthesized back in 1944 and approved for medical use in 1955, sold under the brand name Ritalin. Through the 1960s and 70s, doctors increasingly used it to treat what was then called hyperactive child syndrome, the early clinical ancestor of what we now call attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Then, in 1996, a pharmaceutical company called Shire won approval for a new mixed amphetamine salt formulation. They called it Adderall. The marketing this time did not look anything like Benzedrine's cold remedy branding, and it did not look like the Rainbow Diet Pill clinics either. It looked clinical, careful, and medically legitimate. Diagnoses of ADHD in both children and increasingly adults climbed steadily through the 2000s and 2010s, and prescriptions climbed right alongside them. The chemical had not changed in any meaningful way since Gordon Allais first swallowed it in a Los Angeles laboratory in 1927. What had changed was the framing. A wartime weapon became a housewife's diet pill, and a housewife's diet pill eventually became a schoolchild's daily medication. Each version presented to the public as something entirely new. Which brings the story to right now, to this year, to a version of the same crisis wearing a completely different label. In October of 2022, the Food and Drug Administration officially declared a national shortage of Adderall, the modern brand name built around the exact same core compound, synthesized in that Berlin laboratory back in 1887. it has not meaningfully resolved since that announcement. Stimulant prescriptions across the United States rose by roughly 58% between 2012 and 2022. Prescriptions specifically written for ADHD medications grew by about 60% between 2012 and 2023. Demand simply kept climbing year after year, largely without pause. Meanwhile, the Drug Enforcement Administration's own internal data showed that in 2022, manufacturers actually produced only about 70% of the amphetamine their legal quota allowed them to make, leaving roughly 1 billion doses that could have been produced and simply were not. More than 7 in 10 adults diagnosed with ADHD reported real, tangible difficulty filling their prescription in 2023. Behind every single one of those statistics is a parent calling 5 different pharmacies in a single afternoon. Or an adult quietly skipping a workday because the medication that helps them function normally is simply not in stock anywhere nearby. Zoom out a little further and the picture gets even stranger. Medical amphetamine is now one of the most tightly rationed legal substances in the entire United States, measured out gram by a single federal agency every single year. Its unregulated chemical sibling, methamphetamine, remains one of the largest illicit drug crises on the entire planet, operating on a completely different scale, with almost none of that careful, government-mandated accounting applied to it. 2 epidemics, roughly 30 years apart, treated at the time as if they had nothing to do with each other. A wartime drug problem and a suburban housewife's pill habit were filed away in history as separate stories, told by separate people in separate decades. Only in hindsight does the connecting thread become obvious. Step back far enough, and a pattern starts to emerge that is genuinely hard to unsee once you notice it. This is the 3rd time this exact molecule has swept through an entire population. First, as a wartime weapon, engineered specifically to erase a soldier's basic need for sleep. Then, as a 1960s diet pill epidemic, engineered to erase a housewife's exhaustion and appetite in one convenient tablet. And now, as a surging wave of ADHD diagnoses and prescriptions, engineered, its supporters would argue, to genuinely help people concentrate and function in an increasingly demanding world. Maybe this time really is different. Maybe the medical understanding truly has caught up with the chemistry, and the safeguards in place today are simply better than the ones that failed twice before. Or maybe the pattern is just running for a 3rd time, a little slower, a little quieter, dressed in a far more sympathetic label than Tank Chocolate ever wore. There is at least some movement toward a fix. In October of 2025, the DEA raised production quotas for D-amphetamine by as much as 25%, acknowledging publicly that the existing national supply had become inadequate to meet legitimate patient need. Separately, a class action lawsuit, Barbara versus Shire, accuses brand-name manufacturers of paying rival generic drug makers to delay releasing cheaper versions of Adderall XR onto the market, a claim that the underlying shortage may have been deliberately prolonged, for profit rather than simply mismanaged by accident. Picture that same small pill one more time, 3 milligrams, smaller than an aspirin. In 1940, it was tucked into a soldier's coat pocket under the nickname Tank Chocolate, keeping him marching through a Belgian forest for 10 days straight, whether his body wanted to stop or not. Today, that same molecule sits inside an amber prescription bottle a parent has been trying to track down across 5 different pharmacies this week, hoping that just one of them still has it in stock. Same molecule, roughly the same size, 85 years apart, and somehow still the exact same underlying argument. Who gets to decide how much of it exists, who gets access to it, and who ultimately pays the price when that decision gets made for the wrong reasons? Behind the counter, a pharmacist shakes her head at one more disappointed customer. Somewhere quietly, almost invisibly, the chain keeps going. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind everyday things. We have got a lot more coming.